Okay, welcome everybody to this roundtable on addressing violence against women in politics. What can political scientists do? My name's Lena Krook. I'm a professor of political science at Rutgers University, where I also chair a Women in Politics PhD program. And the reason I had the opportunity to organize this roundtable is that last year I received the 2021 APSA Distinguished Award for Civic and Community Engagement for my work going across the theory and practice divide on the topic of violence against women in politics. So if you see like the official name of this panel, it says the Civic Engagement Award Lecture. But rather than lecture and just talk about myself and things that I've done myself, I thought it would be more productive to organize a roundtable where we got diverse perspectives on different ways that people with political science backgrounds have engaged with the topic of violence against women in politics. And this really very much reflects how the issue of violence against women in politics has gotten on the agenda, how we started to develop the indicators, started to talk about solutions. It's been very collaborative with lots of exchange and learning from one another. So I think it seems appropriate to do this as a roundtable rather than as a lecture. So my own work on the issue of violence against women in politics has had these two major products. The first is a book called Violence Against Women in Politics, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. And it really tries to bring an academic perspective to the topic of violence against women in politics, which had largely been sort of theorized in the practitioner world and less with an academic toolkit. But the book is still very much inspired and informed by the voices of practitioners and political women around the world who've very bravely started to speak up about this issue. The book is also very much interested in mapping solutions to this problem. So it also tries to sort of give back in these sets of debates as well. The second major thing that I've done is I've collaborated with Sandra Pepera and other colleagues in the Women, Gender, and Democracy team at the National Democratic Institute on the Not the Cost campaign to stop violence against women in politics. So Sandra will say a little bit more about that. But it was a very interesting experience of collaborating with a practitioner organization and sort of working together to try to bring people together to talk about this issue and to sort of figure out what it is, right? How do we frame this problem? How do we mobilize awareness and action to address it? So I won't say too much about it because Sandra will talk about it, but I did want to signal that. So thus far, the topic of violence against women in politics has really been a discussion driven by practitioner organizations, right? So these are the organizations that have been working on the ground for many years to try to promote women's political participation. And this was an issue that really sort of emerged organically from the work that they were doing to, train women candidates, support women running for office, support women who've been elected. So some of the organizations, in addition to NDI, include UN Women, UNDP, the Interparliamentary Union, and also the Organization of American States, which is very, very involved in Latin American debates on legal reforms to stop violence against women in politics. So we know a lot really about how practitioners have helped us as scholars understand this issue. But I wanted to flip the focus in this panel to think about, well, what as academics can we contribute, right? How can we help practitioners or work together with them to address this issue? So I've invited 5 of my colleagues to be on this roundtable, 3 of whom are at academic institutions, 2 of whom are in the practitioner world, and one of those is sort of kind of in both of those worlds at the same time. And so I think it'll be a really interesting discussion. So what I've asked my colleagues to address is just this big question of the panel, right? What can political scientists do to address violence against women in politics? And specifically, what specific activities they've been involved with to combat this problem. And then to the extent possible, what are some of the challenges or limitations in trying to address this problem in general, but also as an academic? So before we turn to them, I did just want to say a couple words about violence against women in politics because it's not a concept that's widely familiar to everyone. So in my book, I make this distinction to help understand how violence against women in politics is distinct from other forms of violence in political spaces. So I draw a distinction between what I call violence in politics, which has really been the focus of a lot of the literature on political and electoral violence around the world, right? And it understands violence as something that's perpetrated against political opponents, right? So in that sense, it's like issue-based or political power-based. This kind of violence affects both men and women, tends to be higher in places where there's a violent context, for example, post-conflict situation. Some of the forms it can take are gender differentiated, like sexual violence, but there's also forms that are not gender differentiated. But the main thing about violence in politics is that its democratic costs are widely recognized, right? So there are whole academic fields working on this. There are lots of practitioner organizations concerned about the issue of violence in politics because it's really seen as something that has a serious cost to democracy, right? Because it's about winning the political game through intimidation and harassment, right? Taking out your opponents rather than through like rational liberation and elections. Violence against women in politics is distinct because it's identity-based, right? So it's specifically about targeting women, driven by patriarchal ideas that politics is space for men. Women don't belong there, and therefore they need to be kept out. Some of the forms are gender differentiated, like sexual violence, but there's also, things like assassinations, right? Hate mail, things that might be experienced by men, but not for these reasons. And really what the community of people working on this issue have tried to argue is that this is a form of violence that has democratic costs that have not yet been fully recognized, right? So this is the work that we're trying to do. And I think there's a few reasons why we haven't really had a discussion around violence against women in politics or hasn't been recognized. And that's because politically active women experience both forms of violence, right? They experience violence in politics as well as violence against women in politics. Second, violence against women is highly normalized in our societies, so we really don't see them as anything out of the ordinary. And lastly, there's a tendency, I think, to subsume acts of violence against women in politics underneath violence in politics, right? To sort of see that as a larger category rather than sort of a distinct dimension, interrelated, overlapping form of violence. So this is what we're talking about. I think this graphic from UN Women, which is a study looking at violence against women in politics in India, Pakistan, and Nepal, it just gives us some evidence for the validity of this distinction. This was a survey that asked who perpetrates acts of violence against politically active women, right? So in the case of India, you see that people mentioned other contestant, right? So that's the traditional forms of political violence. But across the three countries, the most common perpetrators are members of women's own political parties, followed by members of their own families, right? So that's not like political violence against your opponents, right, on the other side of the spectrum. That looks a lot more like violence against women or gender-based violence, right? So I think there's an argument here for thinking about both the issue-based and identity-based forms of violence. I'll also say that just because we talk about violence against women in politics, it doesn't mean that gender is the only relevant identity. We see here, for example, in this study on Europe, that young women are particularly targeted for acts of violence in political spaces. On the right, this is data from Amnesty, finds that women of color in the British Parliament were disproportionately targeted with acts of violence, right? So it's not just about gender, but also how it interacts with race and age and other forms of political marginalization. So to say as well that if we look at what it looks like, I just feel like it's important to mention this, but the work in this field tries to get away with what scholars have talked about as a minimalist form of violence, conception of violence, which is just thinking about it as physical violence. And that's a perspective that focuses on the perpetrator and thinks about violence as an act that it has a starting point and a stopping point. In contrast, a more comprehensive definition of violence thinks about it in terms of a violation, right? Rather than just the use of force. It's a violation of a person's integrity in the sense of the wholeness or intactness of the self, right? So you could have your physical integrity violated, but also your mental and psychological integrity violated. And so this is an approach that's very consistent with how feminist activists have thought about violence against women as something that exists along a spectrum. So you have, in the image of the iceberg, right, these like visible physical acts, but they are supported by other types of acts like gendered insults, sexual harassment, right, that are really part of the same continuum, but also bolstering, right, like interacting with one another. So this is really how the practitioner community and academics who work on this have also adopted this broader definition of violence, right? So it's not just the physical forms. Generally, people focus on these 4 types: physical, sexual, psychological, and economic. And these are the 4 forms that are widely recognized in international legislation, declarations, national laws on violence against women. So physical violence, I think that's quite easy, right? Murders, beatings, kidnappings, false imprisonment. Psychological violence would include things like threats, especially like social media abuse. Sexual violence is something that has been very difficult for women in politics to talk about, but has received more attention since the Me Too movement. So things like rape or sexual harassment. And then economic violence is something where you use access to economic resources as a form of intimidation or coercion. So you could think about that as like property damage, right? As a way of trying to get people to stop their political activities, denying them access to economic resources that are available to their colleagues. And in my book, I add a 5th type of violence that I argue is not reducible to those other 4 types. And I call it semiotic violence. And it refers to the use of words, images, symbols, and gestures that aim to degrade and delegitimize women in public life. And it really plays out not so much for the targeted woman, but in front of a larger public, right? It's really about shaping how people think about women's right to participate in politics. So semiotic violence is something that has characterized portrayals of political women like since forever. But it really has gained new life in gender disinformation campaigns in recent years, right? Like most gender disinformation uses semiotic violence against women in politics. So finally, as I said, my book, I include a whole section called To Action. Talk about solutions in 6 different chapters. So really interested in solutions. So my colleagues will talk more about these. I will just mention one, which is a way that I think I'm trying to contribute to these debates, but also ways in which you could engage with this issue as well, right? One of the things I learned about looking at solutions to this issue is that everyone can do something, right? From like the most individual person to political parties, to governments, to international organizations, everyone can do something. And so I have this Twitter account, VAW Politics, that tries to, raise awareness, retweet, share news and studies on this issue. They also have a website, vawpolitics.org, which includes a particular section on research and collects together all of the academic and practitioner contributions on this topic, all open, full text links and everything. So it's a very quick way to find data, get up to speed on this issue as well. Okay, so then I'll turn it over now to my colleagues. So we'll go through order in the program with just one small tweak. Sandra will be the last speaker. So we'll start first with Tracey Raney, who's a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, and her academic work in this area is mainly focused on sexual harassment in the Canadian, British, and Australian parliaments. So just turn over to you, Tracey.
Great. Thank you so much, Mona, for the invitation to come and speak with everybody today. I'm really excited about this panel. I've divided my comments today into 2 different sections. So the first, I'm going to talk about some of the specific activities that I've been engaged in as a researcher studying violence against women in politics. And the second, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the limitations and challenges. One of the specific activities that I've been engaged in is to provide scholarly analysis about the problem of violence against women in politics. But what's unique, I think, about this area of research from other areas of research that I've worked on is I'm always trying to think about solutions, thinking about ways that we can propose concrete ideas for decision makers to try to tackle this issue. As Mona mentioned, my research is particularly focused in the Canadian case specifically. And one sort of current project that I'd like to just take a moment to talk a little bit about is an edited volume that I'm working on with Cheryl Collier that brings together a number of different experts who are talking about in their chapters how to combat violence against women in Canadian politics specifically. And we've asked each chapter author to really focus on proposing solutions that they raise in the content of their chapters. There's one chapter in particular that's written by Rebecca Major and Cynthia Nyobenese-Kwe-Sturbys, where they focus on Indigenous women's experiences engaging with colonial political institutions. We're hoping that the edited volume will be out in the next year. The other main activity that I focus on in my work is community-based research and community engagement. I think that this particular area or topic of research is not one that can be done in a traditional political science silo, and it's important that we are engaging with global practitioners and community organizations. One project that I worked on was in partnership with an organization called Equal Voice, which is a Canadian national nonprofit organization that seeks to promote and encourage more women in politics. And with my team, we worked with Equal Voice, and we had 3 goals in the project. So the first was to co-create knowledge with the partners, so working with the organization, asking them how our research could help them in their advocacy in tackling violence and harassment in Canadian politics. The second goal of the project was to raise awareness about the issue with stakeholders and the public. And the third was to try to enhance public policy discussions. And as a result of that project, we produced a comprehensive scope report that's available for the public to download free from Equal Voice website. And we propose a number of solutions to the problem that are targeted at social media companies, political parties, non-governmental organizations, and the public on how to combat the issue. In addition, I think knowledge exchange between scholars and practitioners is extremely important. So I've been involved in exchanging information with different international organizations where it's really useful for me to bring the Canadian experience to the table, but to also hear about how other countries are tackling this issue specifically. Another area that I have focused my work on is to try to raise public awareness about violence and harassment in Canadian politics. And that means, drawing attention to the fact that violence and harassment doesn't just occur in non-democratic countries, it also occurs in established democracies as well. And so this is something that's really important to flag to decision makers, but also to members of the public. And I've done this in a variety of different ways through op-eds, public analyses, open access journals, and reports. And I think, I was reflecting a little bit on Mona's question about what can political scientists do. One of the things that I think is also important to remember is what can political scientists with tenure do, who, and I will also say that I'm a full professor and I'm at an institution that really values public engagement. So the cost and the risk for me is lower than it would be for other people who are at in other countries and in other institutions. So for me, I think the privilege as a white settler woman who's a full professor with tenure is that I can intervene in public debates and public discussions when particular incidences are occurring. And it means it's sort of a timely reaction rather than waiting for an article that's refereed to come out. Another area of advocacy that's really important to me is that which occurs in the classroom and with our students. So we know that violence and harassment in politics is disproportionately targeted at individuals from marginalized communities. And one of the most important solutions in addressing the problem is to actually change the face of politics itself, to get young people to be interested and encouraged to run for office and to engage in the political process. So in the classroom, I try to find ways to empower the next generation of women leaders, especially students from marginalized communities. In 2018, I co-founded a program with a former member of parliament, Peggy Nash, called the Women in the House program. It's an experiential learning program targeted at students who identify as women. And it's modeled after some programs at other universities, but ours is the first program that's available to students who identify as women and available for course credit. And what we do is we provide mentorship and try to boost the leadership capacities of young women leaders in different fields. So it could be that they're interested in formal politics, but also just leadership generally in all sorts of different fields. And we do things like provide professional development skills and an MP shadowing program where they go to Parliament Hill and shadow a woman MP for the day. Okay, a few of the challenges and limitations of working in this area. The first is that in my research, I've really elected to focus on women actors specifically. And I see that as part of advocacy to get the stories out there, to document experiences that women have when they engage in the political process. But of course, this means that we are excluding other stories that still need to be shared and analyzed. So we can think, for example, about men's experiences as queer, racialized, and Indigenous. And in the Canadian case, we're just starting to document that. I know it's occurring in other jurisdictions, but we really need to deepen and broaden the field in the Canadian case specifically into these other areas. I think another challenge with some of the work that I've been doing, where I've been analyzing the solutions that Canadian decision makers have proposed to deal with this issue in an MP code of conduct on sexual harassment, for example, in a staffing policy in the House of Commons, is what happens when you are providing critical commentary on the decisions that politicians are making themselves, when you would still like to have access to these politicians to interview them for future data collection. And so I raise this is something that I've really reflected on in my own research. And what I've come down to is that it's important to acknowledge and recognize that there are critical actors within political institutions that are really pressing forward on this issue. But at the same time, the ultimate decisions that some of these decision makers are making are deeply flawed. And I think it's important to be truthful in my analysis. And so it's sort of, I guess, a balance that you have to strike. And I think it's important that we're cognizant of that balance, that we're deliberate about it, and that we recognize that the things that we're publishing and writing might have implications down the road for future access to data. The last challenge that I want to just speak very briefly about is a teaching challenge. So as political scientists, we want to encourage our students to think about a career in politics and think about a career in the public sector, while at the same time, the research that we're doing shows that these spaces are likely to be hostile to them. And this poses a real conundrum, I think, as educators. So on the one hand, we want to be encouraging, and on the other hand, they need to be prepared for what they are potentially going to be entering into. So for me, as an educator, I think I need to be truthful with my students about the reality. They see the vitriol anyway. They know who it's primarily directed at on their social media feeds. They see it. But I think that it's also key for us to discuss with our students strategies on how they can protect themselves, how they can be an ally, and where to find supports and resources. And this is where the practitioner tools really come in handy, is to direct our students to what the practitioners are doing and the available resources there for anybody who's thinking about entering into politics. So I really see our role as educators, as political scientists, is to empower young women by giving them the tools, including the necessary information resources they need to engage in the political process on their own terms. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tracey. I think it's just a wonderful, very kind of critical reflection about some of the sort of the academic questions, but also some of those moral and ethical questions as well, right? Doing this type of work. Because people have said to me, like, well, if you raise awareness of violence against women in politics, will you scare women out of political spaces? But my feeling is that, well, you need to prepare women, to meet those challenges. And I think that's important because then they don't individualize the problem, but they think like it's quite like a structural problem, right? So it's like not personal to me, and that makes it a little bit easier, I think, to sort of deal with mentally. Okay, so the next speaker is Juliana Restrepo Sanin, who is an assistant professor at the University of Florida. And her work has focused on violence against women in politics in Latin America, and specifically tracing the diffusion of laws across the region, and also more critically analyzing some of those legislative reforms. Pass to you.
Thank you, Mona, for the invitation, and it's really exciting to be discussing this issue. So I took the questions very seriously. Like, my presentation is really boring because it's question by question, and so I'm not going to bore you with that. So I think the first question was, what can political scientists do to address violence against women in politics? And the first thing that came to mind was, unsurprisingly, more research, and that's the conclusion of every single paper we read. But I think it's really important. The topic of violence against women in politics has been discussed in Latin America since the late 1990s, but there are very few academic research, and there is very few academic research that has that is cross-country research. And I think that comparison is really important, understanding what's going on in other countries. So I think that's something we can do as political scientists. For practitioners on the ground, it's really hard to do that type of research. But for us, in some ways, especially for comparativists, that is kind of the expectation. So I think that type of research that is comparative, that is theoretically driven, that is multidisciplinary, is really fundamental. And I thought something that is probably not very academic, but I think research that is normatively driven, that keeps in mind that this is a problem both for democracy, but also for individual women, that has implications for them and for their families. I think that is key. And I think that research needs also to keep in mind that we need to think about practical solutions. It's really hard for women on the ground to address this problem with some of the work we do. So I think that keeping that in mind and offering ways to think about the problem that they can use to develop solutions that are helpful, it's really key. Another point that I have is that we need to strengthen collaboration, and it's strengthen collaboration with civil society organizations, with international organizations, and with state actors. And in Latin America, electoral institutions have been really important in raising awareness. Some of them have been key allies in promoting and kind of convincing legislators that this is a problem. Usually male legislators, women legislators tend to be easier to convince, but they have been basically saying, yes, this is a problem and we need solutions and we need to have laws and we need to have electoral codes that give us the tools to act. So we as scholars, I think we can serve as important allies for these institutions, because in some way we are impartial actors and we can provide data that sometimes they lack. And we also have that, again, comparative knowledge. We know what's going on in other countries, not always better than activists on the ground, but ideally we will do. So I think that strengthening collaboration is really important. And the third point that I thought is disseminating that knowledge, and that means publishing, of course, books and papers. That's great because that's the audience that we write for, but also going beyond that. And I think I'm going to talk about that in a second when I talk about the challenge. So the second question was, what specific activities have you been involved with to combat this problem? And I've been really lucky to have the opportunity to work with multiple international organizations. I started working with the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy in Colombia when I was still a graduate student, and we did the first report on violence against women in politics in the country. And it was a fantastic experience. No one was talking about the issue back then. It was just this organization. It was actually two women who read our paper, co-author paper, and they became very interested. So we did interviews and they did a survey and we published the first report. And it was fantastic. And it is, I'm really proud of that. It probably shouldn't be, I should be more humble, but when the first bill proposal in Colombia to address violence against women in politics was published, they cited that work, and they keep citing it. So it is something that we can do as political scientists. I think I'm still in contact with them, and they value our academic work very much. I've also worked with the CIM, the Inter-American Commission on Women, and they have done, as Mona mentioned, a lot of the work on violence against women in politics in Latin America. They have a model law that I had the opportunity to revise and offer feedback, and I wasn't the only academic. There were other experts in Latin America, working on this. But also they have the regional vision and kind of the expertise to work with multiple stakeholders. And I've also, and this is fantastic, I had the opportunity to work last year with NDI in a training course for Latin American activists, members of electoral institutions. There were feminist lawyers, politicians, women in politics, on the topic of violence against women. And I'm not sure if Sandra is going to talk a bit more about this, but it was a capacity building course. And it was a very great experience and opportunity to talk about violence against women in politics, to teach a very different audience. I'm not used to teaching. I teach undergrads, and it was a very different experience. And to engage with them. And one thing that I really learned from that class, from that experience, is how important those spaces are for strengthening connections between academics, but also among activists, again, different stakeholders, politicians, members of electoral institutions, cross-nationally. This group has been fantastic. The first day we had the first class, they created a WhatsApp group, and a year after we finished the class, they're still in contact with each other. They have invited each other to events. So that experience and being part of that was also great and very different from an academic experience. So now I wanted to talk about the challenges. And I understood this question in two ways. One was the challenges to working collaboratively between academics and practitioners, and more broadly, the challenges of studying violence against women in politics. So the challenges of strengthening these collaborations, I think the first one that came to mind was timelines. Our work is very slow, and it takes years to get papers, let alone books, published. So that timeline doesn't really fit the realities on the ground. The world outside academia works way faster, and we probably should be thinking about ways of making our research more available more quickly. The second challenge that I thought of was the kind of the tensions between academic rigor and practical needs. And I think this is more obvious when we do quantitative research, when we care a lot about p-values and how statistically significant things are, but sometimes that is irrelevant for practitioners because they need solutions now. And if something has a p-value of 0.1 or 0.5, that's really not important for them. And I think that's an invitation for us to think beyond, not because I don't think rigor is irrelevant. I think it's really important, but what we consider to be rigorous is maybe the question. The third point was accessibility. And this is in terms of paywalls, jargon. The extension of the work is sometimes not very useful for people who are working on violence against women in politics, but also other many things. So reading a 30-page paper for 3 important conclusions maybe is not the best use of their time. I also thought about a lot of the work is being published in English, and in Latin America, people don't have access. So thinking about ways to translate the work, and I can imagine it's the same for people in other regions. So that is another level or another challenge. Another limitation, and this is probably very selfish, but it's university constraints in terms of what Tracey mentioned of tenure, conflict of interest, outside work, that really limit how much we can engage with other organizations and the type of work we can do with them, because for the most part, it doesn't count for tenure in most institutions. So we have to assess how much of our time we can actually do with that. And the final point, or the final challenge that I had, is funding. Because the problem is not very well known, I don't think a lot of funding institutions are paying attention and are not funding it. And I think that's, of course, always a challenge. In terms of addressing violence against women in politics, not just this tension or these collaborations between practitioners and academics, well, I think the first one, and it's been for a while, it's the lack of comparable data. We have countries use different definitions, count different manifestations. When they do work, sometimes it's just at the national level, sometimes it's at the subnational level, sometimes it's women mayors, sometimes it's women mayors and councillors, and that, from an academic perspective, makes comparison really hard. And we don't have accurate data in general. It comes from mostly women's organizations doing work on the ground, and that work is fantastic, but it's, from an academic point of view, going back to the p-values and everything, it's really hard to work with that data. The other challenge is that our concerns for measurement and validity do not always capture women's experience. And I think this is generally a problem with mostly quantitative work, but it also can happen in qualitative work, is that there's a lot of things that are missed when we translate their experiences with violence, in this case, to academic work. So I think that remains a challenge, and we should be paying attention to that. The fourth challenge is, Mona already mentioned, I think violence in politics is very normalized in general, and violence against women in general, not in politics, is very much normalized. And what we see is usually the tip of the iceberg. We don't see all the things that led to a woman being killed. And in my experience, in the cases that I've analyzed, there are a lot of indicators, a lot of red flags that could have stopped that murder, but we just didn't see them because we thought of them as normal. And the final challenge is that it's not seen as a priority. We've heard this, or I've heard this a lot, is that, well, women knew what they were facing when they went into politics. They are privileged women, so they should, it's not we shouldn't worry about that. They have resources, especially when it's women at high levels. So it's not seen as a priority. And of course, that makes things very challenging. So thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you. I just want to reflect on what you said about accessibility. So one of the ways that Juliana and I tried to increase our accessibility was there was a call for articles for special issue on gender and political violence in Latin America. So we took the opportunity, and they said that if you're accepted, we'll publish your articles in both Spanish and English. And it's an open access journal based out of Mexico City. And that's actually turned out to be really a great way to disseminate our research. I mean, of course, I collaborate with the native Spanish speaker. So Juliana just translated it. But I think that was an example, I think, of good practice too, and that it's open access, it's accessible in other language, I think is good. Also just mention that UN Women is also thinking about how to systematize data collection on this issue. So we had some really interesting workshops with academics and statisticians over at UN Women about how to do that, right? So that's still in progress, but I think that's a good example of how do we try to think about the indicators, measurements, and be more comparative, but still in progress. Okay, so then the next speaker is Catherine Wineinger, who is an assistant professor at Western Washington University. Kathy's work is on women in American politics. She has a new book called Gendering the GOP, which is amazing. It's based on her award-winning dissertation on this topic. But she was, after finishing her PhD, she spent 1 year in Washington as a APSA congressional fellow, working in the office of Representative Rashida Tlaib. So she'll talk about that.
All right. Thank you so much, Mona. Yes, as Mona said, I was an APSA Congressional Fellow in the Office of Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib in 2019 to 2020. And so I want to talk a little bit about my experience there. I'm actually not a scholar of violence against women in politics, although I am, sort of transitioning towards that now with my newer project. But I wanted to start with this tweet by Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal that she posted actually last week. She had recorded voicemails that she received and her office received. And she says, quote, "Typically political figures don't show their vulnerability. I chose to do so here because we cannot accept violence as our new norm. We also cannot accept the racism and sexism that underlies and propels so much of this violence." So I'm just going to play a short, portion of this so you can really see how this violence is rooted in misogyny, racism, etc.
Yourself, how do you like sucking that Biden? Hey, careful, Paul. You gotta be the ugliest mother in the world. Who beat you with an ugly stick? You ugly fucking. Hey, why don't you guys go back to where you came from? There ain't none of these goddamn citizens.
So I share that because I heard this last week, and it was just like immediate flashbacks to working in Congresswoman Tlaib's office. And it was actually the result of receiving voicemails like this, just like every day, constantly, and seeing the impact that it had on the folks who received those phone calls, which were other staffers in our office, typically also women of color. And it reminded me of the work that my colleagues at Rutgers had been doing on this issue of violence against women in politics. So I, got in touch with Mona, with Juliana, Rebecca Kupperberg, and we decided, we thought about how can we address this at the congressional level. And I went to Congresswoman Tlaib, and I asked her, is this an issue that you would consider working on? And immediately she said yes. I thought it might take some convincing, but she was just immediately, no hesitation. Yes, I want to work on this. And I really want to emphasize that this is an issue that happens in the United States, because so many of my colleagues know that violence against women in politics happens, but they don't understand that their own colleagues are facing that kind of violence. So I worked with Mona, Juliana, Rebecca, and also Sandra at NDI. And the first thing that we did was we wrote a 1-minute floor speech where Congresswoman Tlaib actually talked about the Not the Cost campaign, talked about her own experiences with violence against women with violence against her and her family. And this was really the first time that the concept of violence against women in politics was brought to the House floor. And we immediately wanted to sort of, our intent was to introduce a resolution right after this. This was, though, an International Women's Day speech in March of 2020. So right after that, we also had the COVID-19 pandemic. And so sort of resources really shifted to COVID relief. So we really didn't get a chance to do that until about August of 2020, when Representative Ocasio-Cortez was essentially accosted on the steps of the Capitol by Representative Ted Yoho, calling her, an effing bee. And she took that sort of as an opportunity to speak on the House floor and really bring national attention to the issue of violence against women in the workplace, talking about this as a systemic issue, as a cultural issue. The Democratic Women's Caucus put out a statement about this incident, calling it an attack meant to intimidate and silence women. So again, very much in line with this idea of violence against women in politics. So this really gave us also an opportunity, this national attention to this violence gave us an opportunity to introduce a resolution in the House that calls on the United States government to recognize violence against women as a global phenomenon and to take steps to mitigate it. It was co-sponsored by Representatives Tlaib, Ocasio-Cortez, Omar, Presley, and Spear, and it was reintroduced this Congress as House Resolution 801 with Representative Cori Bush as an additional co-sponsor. So if you want to look it up on congress.gov, you can see that. But I wanted to take a moment to, talk about some of the challenges and limitations. And again, I do think that folks here on this panel and everyone who is working to address this issue understands a lot of these challenges. So I want to really just talk about it from the context of my experience in congressional politics. So the first is, challenges around framing. And as we've sort of talked about already, is that this can potentially be demobilizing, right? When we bring attention to this kind of violence. When I first went to Rashida, she said, if I had known that me and my family would face this kind of violence, I would not have run for Congress. And so I think that, making sure that when we talk about this issue, that how can we create an empowering space for women at the same time that we draw attention to the issue? I think a second framing challenge is that it can paint women lawmakers as victims, right? I mean, a lot of women in politics are victims of violence, right? This type of gender-based violence. But I think it's difficult then for women to show that kind of vulnerability, right? As we saw at the beginning, Pramila Jayapal saying lawmakers usually don't show their vulnerability. And I think that becomes a challenge to get women to initiate a response when it can be perceived by the outside world as, oh, you're just painting yourself as a victim, and this is an issue that is about only you. So I think working to address that, which I think we do well, which I will talk about too. But then there, I think, are political challenges as well, right? We introduced a House resolution. House resolution does not change public policy or law. It is simply the sentiment of the House, right? It encourages the United States government to do something. And that resolution was never actually passed. It was introduced, referred to committee, and just sort of died there. So what are the political challenges of actually getting these things through the policymaking process? I think one challenge is, as Juliana said, prioritizing this kind of legislation, right? A lot of times, again, this is viewed as affecting political women in the political class. But can we find ways that show that this is actually really important for your constituents and for the women in your circles, right? And for participatory democracy. The second challenge around political, in terms of the politics, is inter-party conflict. I have talked to a lot of progressive women of color in particular who talk about the fact that a lot of the perpetrators of violence against them are members of their own party, right? And if they are not the perpetrators themselves, they at least feel that party leadership is either not doing enough to mitigate it or is enabling it through their rhetoric, through their actions. And so how do you build coalitions even within your party while taking these realizations seriously that this is actually an issue within your own party? And then third is, of course, building these, cross-party coalitions, which is much more challenging. I think there's definitely an intersection here between gender, race, partisanship, and ideology, where you have folks, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, essentially both being a victim of violence against women in politics and also a perpetrator of violence against women in politics. And sort of justifying that through political means. And so how could you build coalitions across party and ideology? So what can political scientists do? I think, as folks said, amplify women's voices and experiences, both through research and through other platforms, like Muna's website and her Twitter feed, I think are great examples of that. Help frame the conversation. So again, framing this really as a global issue, including like the United States, as Tracey was saying as well, framing this as a threat to democracy, right? As affecting your constituents on this very fundamental level, as affecting the democratic principles of the country. And so I think that's sort of a way to show. To help to prioritize the issue, and then framing it as a reason for more diverse women to engage in politics, right? Because we know that as more diverse voices come into these spaces of power, it allows women to build coalitions with each other, to work together in solidarity, and it normalizes women, including and especially women of color and of other marginalized identities in these spaces. So really framing that as sort of that issue. And then finally, I really think it's important for political scientists to take opportunities that allow us to work directly with lawmakers. I think the APSTA Congressional Fellowship Program is a great way to do that. It's a really great opportunity for me to bring political science into the halls of Congress and share sort of the expertise that political scientists can bring, but also that recognizing it really is a two-way street, and that it's important to listen to the concerns that lawmakers have in terms of the political and institutional constraints that are specific to the institutions that they're working with, and really trying to understand how can we go about addressing this problem within that context. So that is what I have. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. And actually, I think it's really telling that both Tracey and Kathy talked about the importance of emphasizing this as like an issue that doesn't just happen in other places, right? But also in our own countries as well. And one of the things that I've noticed over the last couple of years is a huge interest, growing discussions about among women in local politics and state politics. Obviously, also with Me Too, there was discussions about sexual harassment, violence in state legislatures. And what we're seeing globally is that it's actually women at the local levels, at the subnational levels, that that's really the unspoken conversation. They're probably experiencing very high levels of violence, but they have fewer protections, fewer opportunities to be heard. So I think that's just a great point. And just on the democracy issue, I was once in an event, and an electoral authority in Mexico said, the problem, violence against women in politics is a problem for democracy, not just because it affects the individual woman who might not run or might leave politics or doesn't speak out, but it actually harms citizens, right? So citizens have cast their vote for these women, for example, right? So if those women are sort of hounded out of office, that actually violates citizens' democratic rights to have the representatives they choose, right? So I think we really want to think about democracy, beyond the individual targeted women. Okay, so then the next panelist is Kristina Wilfore, who's an adjunct lecturer at George Washington University. She's also the co-founder of She Persisted, which is an organization that looks at gender disinformation and violence against women in politics online. So pass over to you. I think there was a way to make this the whole screen, but I forgot how. We'll figure it out.
Thank you so much. I'm going to see how I flip through these okay, great. Thank you so much for your leadership in this field. I am mostly a practitioner swimming in the waters, a little bit of academia, but more like dog pedaling. So I've been working on campaigns and elections since I was 19. So many moons ago. And I think that that's helpful as we look at the research that's needed and the empirical evidence in order to move this conversation within academia or in the halls of Congress and halls of Parliament. But we need to also be steeped in the realities of what it means to actually work on a campaign and to help women who are in the halls of power. So I have made some recommendations here more from the perspective of what as a practitioner can we see more of or want more from political scientists. I have the benefit of being able to work with the George Washington University's capstone course, where they really brought me in to bridge this gap so that we could set up more research, working with clients and organizations around the world, and really teach the methodology around especially understanding online harms. So that's the angle that I'm going to focus on. First recommendation is to continue to document the growth and evidence of these harms. I think this has been reinforced by every panelist here. I can't understate the importance of the qualitative experience of women and the personal testimony. In fact, it was a Montreal institute that we were asked to take panel discussions and some courses they had done, some information they gathered from journalists and women in politics in Canada, and put that into a white paper. And those are some of the most important, I think, findings we've really seen to characterize the nature of the problem. We had a woman who said, I would never run for office again. She was targeted with a campaign. Her son had a disability. She was called a retard breeder. This followed her throughout the campaign. So we have to get to the granular examples of how these kinds of campaigns are organized. And we don't really have as much quantitative data that characterizes the field. I mean, these are some of the pieces of evidence that we use at She Persisted to pull together. In 2020, I worked with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. We asked them to come into the US to document the experiences online for women in Congress, to illustrate to journalists as well as to policymakers themselves that there is a gendered component of these attacks, because there's a false notion that politics is dirty for men too, and in escalating violence for everyone who is in office, there's not necessarily something that is specific to women. But what we hear from women, no matter the country or context, is that their experiences in politics are being dramatically shaped, especially by online violence, by the way that social media is factored into the situation, and disinformation specifically, and how that's making their lives very, very dangerous to conduct normal course of business. So I think when we pull out the specific examples, we might actually do better in the resourcing and bringing the funding together to fully map and provide the evidence for what we need. And that feeds into the rest of how we push back on some of the elements here that are at play. My second recommendation is to recognize that undermining of women leaders is in fact correlated with the growth of anti-democratic behavior. If we look at Freedom House measurement of the state of freedom in the world, I think we're on the 18th consecutive year of decline. And so that's why this is not just an issue of what we consider countries that are more violent, which is a whole racist kind of notion. And in fact, we need to look deeply at illiberal democracies and solid democracies in the way that gender and attacking women is meant to then, in fact, achieve other agendas. So in the German election for chancellor last fall, we could see that Anna Barbeck, who's now the foreign minister, had 5 times more attacks on her based on questioning her qualifications. And we saw that those were amplified largely from Russia. I think now when we look at the situation and the war against Ukraine, perhaps they didn't want the Green Party candidate as the successful chancellor for running Germany, knowing what was coming next in Ukraine from the Russia side. So those are the dots that we have to connect by taking different pieces of evidence in real time and putting it into the context of what we know of gender disinformation and violence against women. I just returned, actually flew in from Brazil, where I'm working against what some refer to as the Trump of the tropics. My work is really supporting research organizations who are mapping and understanding the way that disinformation and misinformation and attacks on women, which is a hallmark of authoritarians in the way that they take gendered attacks, whether they're against LGBTQ, transgender candidates, or all the dimensions of gender. So pulling out this kind of information for reporters is really important as we think about how do we characterize what's going on in real time and how do we try to put it into the context of the state of democracy. The third recommendation is how do we look specifically at the role of social media and digital platforms themselves. Maria Ressa talks very articulately about this environment and herself being a subject of gender disinformation. We have to understand that social media is not a mere reflecting sexism in society. It is a behavior modification machine. And that's why much of my research and efforts in the last few years have been focused on the online environment because it's supersizing all the things we knew before that are about how dangerous it is to run for office and to be in politics. And so this requires a level of precision and understanding the platforms themselves and how they operate that we're missing in academia. We need to bridge the digital institutes and the social media analysis that typically is done in a communications division within universities and move it into foreign affairs and international affairs and other aspects of academia. Because what we see from the evidence that really is being done by mostly civil society and some research, but really nonpartisan research organizations, is that social media and digital platforms themselves are amplifying the societal biases against women. And this, I believe, is the most urgent issue we have to deal with because it's transforming politics as we know it. And so we need academia to do more what civil society is doing, which is evaluating the status of platforms. An organization like Ultraviolet, which is a gender justice digital rights group in the US, did a report card assessing the platform's policies, because what we know is that they in fact have things like existing terms of service to deal with the harassment, violence, threats against women. But in a self-regulatory arena, they are not implementing those terms. I had the opportunity over the last few months to work with Kenyan organizations and activists who were mapping in the lead up to the Kenya election in August the way that gender disinformation and attacks were organized. This is an organization called Nendo. And we were able to take the frameworks of She Persisted, how we're developing, showcasing what implicit bias means, and really handing those over to Nendo so that they could look more specifically at the illustrative examples that characterize the attacks. And these are some of the sexualized attacks. I think it's important to show these images, to hear the audio, to face and bring light to the specifics of how egregious this is. In the conversation I was having with researchers and activists in Brazil yesterday, they were saying, there are thousands and thousands of threats to the children of women candidates running, to rape, to murder them. We don't know what to do with this. Should we just continue tracking it? Should we put it out in the public? So this is what researchers who are looking at the online environment are in fact facing. My recommendation is a whole different panel, but just to say a tiny bit here, is that we have to be more specific when we're interested in bringing disinformation evidence and empirical analysis. We have to decide, well, what does that mean? Are we trying to look at the sources of disinfo and need a forensics level kind of examination? Are we looking at the spread of disinfo, the way that information from sort of the hands of humans and the fingertips of humans is helped promoted? Are we trying to look at the impact of disinformation and the way of what we've heard on this panel? Women are saying, this is not a field for me. I do not want to experience this. I would also put an emphasis on public opinion research, which is not as emphasized within academia, that really gives us the nature of what does the public think of this? How are they seeing these attacks against women? How are they seeing the role of regulators? Who do they hold responsible for fixing this? So this is some data from Kenya that really characterized that Kenyans aren't blaming themselves, that most people do blame themselves when you start to talk about social media harms. They're really also looking for leadership among regulators and other stakeholders who can shape this. And that's important then for having meaningful solutions in which we can bring to actual public policy. So it's an interesting examination on this. Fourth recommendation, mapping the drivers of misogyny online is also very important. In the context of Canada, it's a thriving manosphere, also in the US. This is a term that's been developed to really characterize this interconnected misogynistic communities online that are a pathway to extremism, that are tied in with white nationalism, that are undermining elections. This is a vector for all sorts of of work. There's an entire language and taxonomy now online that is specifically based on hating women. We need to get underneath, how is this manosphere at work? How is it driving the traditional ways in which violence has been expressed against women? What does it look like in each country? And how is it interconnected globally? Because we see, especially with the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the United States, that this evangelical push is now moving into many countries, not only in Western states, but all over the world. So that's an important context to look at the ecosystem in popular culture and the way that this is driving things like hate towards women in politics. This is the #1 YouTube star in Kenya who is reshaping attitudes towards women, not just women leaders, but women's sexuality, their hygiene, their health, their very dignity is being debated. And when we mapped what was coming out of these podcasts and some of these YouTube stars, we could see that they believe men are the real victims. They believe that there's no such thing as family planning, that it's all a woman's problem, that women don't take care of themselves, that women force responsibility on men. And so we see a real backlash to the girl child in parts of Africa, I believe, as a result directly of this kind of content and these kinds of toxic male amplifiers. Last recommendation is to document, and I think we just already heard this on the panel, great to reinforce this point. We need real-time data, pre-election, mid-election, post-election, with local researchers and civil society organizations. We need to lower the bar to be able to have the kind of evidence that shapes in real time the understanding of the harms and how we can help women resist them, how we can build societal response against them. In the first debate a couple weeks ago at the presidential level in Brazil, there was attack against the journalist who asked Bolsonaro the question about COVID and his response to COVID. And he said, "You must go to bed sleeping about me. You are in love with me, and you're a disgrace to Brazil." Now, we could see online, the second photo features the way that this triggered an online community to attack her, to undermine her, to threaten violence against her. A really wonderful set of organizations in Brazil, academic and some nonpartisan organizations, have been mapping for the last year, almost 2 years, the way that attacks on journalists are also part of the machinery in which undermines women in elections, undermines really any women who is choosing to speak out. And we could also see in real time, the graph at the right, when we mapped it, how this was being organized online. So the last thing I will say is, at the university, we are really happy to have received support from the National Science Foundation for putting together what we're calling Expert Voices Together, which is a response system to women under attack, women experts. In this case, we're focusing first on women journalists, but it extends to scientists, to healthcare providers. So I'm afraid this next panel next year will look more at the other sectors too that are being really implicated by this hateful online environment towards women, which is attacking facts and attacking really science. So lots of work to do.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really pleased that Kristina was able to join us, because one of the things I've noticed in sort of keeping up with the literature on violence against women in politics is that I would say the largest share focuses on online violence, and especially social media platforms and Twitter data in particular. And so I think it's really important for us to think about how that research could then inform some of these sort of real world questions. I'd also just mention that we could also think about violence against women in politics, not just in terms of like elected women or candidates, but also in terms of any woman who wants to be politically involved. So that's like voters, party members, political journalists, activists, right? And that's really where I think the global conversation is going, is thinking about this as women trying to participate in politics, right? Not just as elected politicians, right? So this is a problem that potentially affects a much broader array of women. All right, so finally, I'll introduce Sandra Pepera, who's my great friend from the National Democratic Institute. Sandra is a trained political scientist, has gone the non-academic route in her career. Since she took over as head of the Gender, Women, and Democracy team at NDI, they've really ramped up their sort of evidence base in terms of women's political participation in the Not the Cause campaign. Violence against women in politics has been a huge part of that. So NDI has great data that we can also use as academics. So I'll just pass it over to you, Sandra. Oh, sorry, I closed. Here's this one.
Yeah, it's only pictures. Yeah. Few pictures. So thanks very much, Lena, and thanks for having me. It's been fabulous listening to all of you talk about the work that you've been doing, because it just so resonates with what we've known. And Mona has been our partner in crime, in a way, on this for 8 years, since 2014, late 2014. She became our technical consultant. There she is, looking as young then as she does today. And we have had a fabulous partnership and collaboration that we at NDI are forever grateful for. And Mona's generosity with her time and her intellect is an example that I think many other political scientists could usefully follow. So you've heard a lot about the Not the Cost campaign. I thought I would put up some photographs here. This was our launch of the Not the Cost campaign in March 2016, sorry. You'll see some faces that you recognize. Do you call her the First Lady here? I'm not sure, but the Prime Minister's wife closed out the launch of that campaign. The late Madeleine Albright was also with us there. We had parliamentarians and activists from around the world. 5 years later, we launched the Not the Cost renewed call to action. And of course, we were in COVID time. So this was an online version of the previous event. And again, you can see Maria Ressa, somebody mentioned her earlier on. We had Asa Regnier from UN Women up there. The top left, the governor of Michigan was also on that panel. And Madeleine Albright, who was the chair of NDI's board, really championed this work. I mean, she was absolutely keen, always turned out for everything we asked her to do. And the first time we launched the campaign in 2016, we made a global call. And the global call was for the UN to start routinely reporting on violence against women in politics, because we did, even then, see it as three things: a violation of women's human rights, a violation of women's civil and political rights, and a threat to democracy. It has always been thus. And we really wanted to make sure that the UN was part and parcel of these solutions. Our first call to action had a section, it was thin then, but it had a section called Opportunities for Action, and it looked at the different players. Lena said everybody could do something. And so we had a section about civil society actors, we had a section on political party actors, we had a section on governments and electoral bodies and parliamentarians. So we've always had that focus on solutions as well. And we absolutely did ground it in a global experience. So our very first short video on the issue had Kirsten Gillibrand, Jackie Spear, Deborah Wasserman-Schultz, and Gwen Moore in it. So there were some women in the US Congress even then who understood this as an issue and understood it as much as an issue here as it was everywhere else. So what did we learn about bridging theory and practice? A lot of what's been said already is absolutely part of our experience. We learned that working principles are good. We had to establish, if you like, the framework that was going to be the sort of irreducible minimum of what we did and how we did it. So testimonies have become a very key part of everything we do. Our program guidance to our country colleagues when they're running programs on violence against women in politics, you start with a testimony. You ask a survivor to come up and actually describe her experience. It validates her own experience. It allows other women to speak about their experience, and it just sets the tone for the issue. So the testimony piece was important to us. We also always placed this violence in the spectrum of violence against women and girls. So for NDI, when you see us write the acronym for violence against women in politics, we just write VAW-P, because we were very clear that this is violence against women. It's just happening in this space. Or we write VAW-E, violence against women in elections, or VAW-PP, violence against women in political parties. It's always about violence against women. It's just the spaces that are changing and shifting. And so we never, if you see a VAW-IP, you know that that's not an NDI acronym. That's somebody else's acronym. Because for us, it was very clear that we wanted to be part and parcel of the spectrum of violence against women, but understanding that this had certain different manifestations and ramifications to it. The second thing we learned was that the best partners are equally strong. And Lena gave us what has become almost my team's motto for everything we do, which is that we needed to be theoretically rigorous and politically convincing, because that's where we sit. We sit with theoretical rigor and being politically convincing. And politically convincing means most of the time convincing women politicians, but also clearly the male leadership of most of the political institutions that we're dealing with. And you cannot go in there unless you can really bring something to them that gives them that aha moment. So this is how we have worked together. And again, I would say that our experience has been very humbling and affirming in that Lena has definitely accepted that we know what we're doing in our space. We know what we're doing in our space, and she can help us to create that theoretical rigor around it. And so that's been a very important piece. Focus on making something new together. And again, there's a long list of things that we've done through this collaboration, including, I was listening, Kristina, to your discussion of the manosphere and the very alarming situation with the Brazilian journalist. You know, we've coined the term, it's a gateway effect. So things can move offline into the physical space. And, you know, why did we come up with gateway? Well, frankly, I was just thinking about people who were all saying that, you know, if you start soft with, you know, marijuana, you may end up, you know, being, you know, a meth head or whatever. It's that idea that things break through membranes and barriers. So we've coined that. Lena's got a book. We now have a suite of tools and approaches to addressing this issue in the political space. As I said, violence against women in elections, political parties. We've done online work. We have a risk assessment tool that allows women to make an informed choice about the safety and security that they need. So Tracey, when you were talking about putting women off, it's interesting because even in developing this, we started off calling it a lethality assessment because we borrowed it from the IPV, from the Intimate Partner Violence, Domestic Violence world, where they actually do lethality assessments. And of course, can't stick, because how on earth are you going to say to some young woman, yes, you should go into politics, but first take a lethality assessment? So, you know, as we developed the tool, which is actually an assessment of each woman's individual political profile set against the political risk of being politically active in her country, then she's able to develop a safety plan. And it's based on the idea that if Norway is the best place to be a woman in politics, not every woman in Norway is equally safe. And if North Korea is the worst place, not every woman in North Korea is equally under threat. Okay, so this Think 10 tool is what we've called it. It's got a wonderful heat map with 57,000 different calculations in it, but allows some, not precision, but at least some ballparking of what a particular profile of woman in a particular political context needs to do to keep somewhat safer than she would be otherwise. So we've made new things. Juliana, I think, and also Tracey and Kathy and Kristina all talked about synchronizing watches. It is really, really hard because sometimes we're running really fast. We don't even know what we're seeing. Literally, we're saying, this is something new. What's this? And Mona Lee is saying, no, calm down. We can do this. We can put something around it. But then the research time lag can just be too long. We need people who are, if you like, research in action mode and moving alongside us. So there's the actuality of what we need and when we need it. And then people mentioned 10-year cycles and funding cycles. There are just so many things that need to be aligned, and having a flexibility is really key. So synchronizing the watches is hugely important. And then finally, it's obvious, isn't it? Understand what's in it for all parties. The incentive for the political scientist is going to be the article or the promotion or the book. The incentive for me is, how do I help the women in Honduras who are, under duress? What is it? How do I understand the level of femicide in general and how that impacts when women then stand up in the political sphere? So I am trying to change the world in real time, and you are trying to engage in some of these issues for a different set of incentives. We have to understand them and actually recognize them. It's fine. But if you're not in some ways honest about those, I think that's where issues come up. And then the last thing I think we get from these sorts of partnerships is exactly what we've all been talking about, really. It's the global reach across women's movements. And I think time and again, when we do these panels, we have these events, we've been on a roadshow, I don't know, IPU, all sorts of places. We rock up and we're doing something and we're talking about these issues. But each time you're igniting a conversation or you're igniting an awareness in other people in the room. Often, political women will say, we thought we were the only people. They don't even understand that this is a global phenomenon. And then you're also reaching across professional divides. Most recently, we've been doing work in Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Mexico, and we're going to add Guatemala and Liberia, on creating alliances now between women in politics and women in the media, because they're often facing exactly the same sorts of violence and structurally the same sorts of issues. But the patriarchy basically sets them against each other. And we're now trying to create new coalitions where they can actually work together to overcome the violence that each of them faces. So this business about growing that, the reach across women's movements, I think is also a real kind of bonus of these kinds of collaborations. And I heard a lot about the issues around data and data collection. As Mona said, I used to be an academic. I wasn't a very good one, which is why I'm no longer an academic. But it is, those things are hugely important. Those things are hugely important. All I would ask is that when we focus on the need for that theoretical rigor, we do so with the understanding that even as we apply some of these frameworks and these research methodologies, that they are already in some way tilted and biased against women's views of the world, against women's ability to tell their own story, against the validation of women's knowledge, against some of those issues that sort of seep in the sort of, I don't know how to describe it. It's like an osmosis, you know. We call it implicit bias, but there's a constant undermining of the feminist position and women's voices. And so, yes, let's have rigor, but let's separate that out from, frankly, the idea that the world is still framed as very, very male. I was walking around the corridors and I was thinking, God, there's a lot of men here, you know. And you know, that's probably the profession. Then I wonder how much it is also about the fact that many women can't be here any longer because they've got increased domestic burdens. They haven't had the research funding over the last 2 years. We know that women's publications have dropped by 70% since the start of COVID. So that business about the iceberg and the tip and the sort of the larger piece that is not seen below the waterline is as true for most of the things we've talked about today as it is for violence against women in politics. But I want to thank everybody because it's been a pleasure to listen to this conversation this afternoon, and we work with everyone. We work with them all. Kristina she's a practitioner gone rogue and joining the academics, and Kathy and Juliana are again examples of Mona Lena's kind of focus on growing the cadre of people who are looking at this work. And Tracey, pleasure to meet you. There was a story when you were speaking. There's a story a Canadian candidate told me. A woman of color, somewhere out, you call them the ridings, somewhere out in the ridings, you know, and in Alberta or somewhere. And she knocks on the door. She was still knocking on the door. And this man opened the door and she said, I'm the candidate and this is my name. And he looked at her and he said, aren't there any white people left here? And this is the reality of what women face. You may think, just how he is, a grumpy old man or whatever. But it's a constant. It's a constant drip, drip, drip. And it's insidious, and it actually does have an impact on women's engagement in the politics. But it's also more than mean. It's also more than mean. Misogyny is not the end of it. We are now faced with deliberate political tactics and deliberate political strategies to push women out of that space. Because, you know, as I said yesterday, autocrats know that when you have the capacity to choose something, you have the capacity to change it. And that is really why it's hugely important that we all do as much as we can to reverse this issue around women's political participation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to respond really quickly to the example that Sandra gave about how we what we call this phenomenon. And one of the interesting debates that many practitioners told me was this debate about, do we call this like electoral violence against women, or would we call this violence against women in elections, right? Or violence against women in politics. And it really shows how like the theoretical issues are tied up with the practical ones, right? So the argument that they made for why we should call it violence against women in politics is that brings like a feminist definition, right, of violence against women into political spaces. Whereas if you called like political violence against women, you're sort of highlighting definitions that exist on political violence and sort of adding women to that. So I think it's really interesting that there was this convergence of perspectives that we should really center the gender-based violence aspect of this, and that would have practical implications. And the second thing I would just say is that the question of testimonies, I think, is really interesting because as part of this project, I've been on many panels with women politicians, and it's just fascinating when women start to speak up about this issue. They'll say, I've never talked about this in public, right, before. Or there was one woman who stood up from like Georgia after someone from, I think, Ivory Coast was speaking, and she said, I find my story in your story. And like the solidarity and the consciousness raising was really interesting. Even women who agreed to be interviewed by me were like, well, I don't normally talk about this, right? But I felt like I should do that. And it just reminded me of a famous definition of consciousness raising that I think it was Catherine McKinnon, where she talked about consciousness raising as like the theory, the method, the data collection, and the political driver of feminism, right? And so I think that that's really why consciousness raising is so important to the politics, but also to the theory and how we think about this issue. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But I really want to thank everyone for coming, everyone on the live stream or who will view this live stream later as a recorded video for coming. If you do have questions, please feel free to approach the panelists afterwards. Yes, please, follow up on all the resources that we've given and use the hashtag #NotTheCost if you want to help raise awareness that violence should not be the cost of women's political participation. Thank you.